Capitalism and socialism, like smoking, are perfectly democratic in private among consenting adults. Capitalism exploits the majority. Socialism the minority. Both are equally undemocratic. Both socialism and capitalism must for their very existence have others that they can exploit. Democratic socialism is thus as much a contradiction in terms as is democratic capitalism. Jesus Christ said, "Love thy neighbour." Lord Atkin said, "Thou must not injure thy neighbour." Democracy says if you can't love your neighbour or avoid injuring him, then you must at the very least not impose yourself on him. The British are always accused of being standoffish, but this is only out of respect for others, which is what democracy means. The word impose is the French impôt, meaning taxes. The sole aim of political parties under majority rule is to get 51% of the vote by any form of deception so that they can impose their political philosophy on the other 49%. On the one hand, the low taxes of capitalism, and the other screwing everything they can get out of them, squeezing till the pips squeak, as it was put by Dennis Healy, the redistribution of income and wealth. In other words, out and out theft. At least Robin Hood was honest about it, robbing from the rich to give to the poor. The capitalists just want to keep their wealth. The socialists just want to get it. That's all they're in politics for. These days you never hear the Conservatives talking about socialism. You rarely hear the Labour Party talking about capitalism. They just present their own arguments and ignore those of the others. That way they keep two sets of politicians gainfully employed at the public expense. Those who suffer are primarily young people. Before William the Conqueror, fortifications like Iron Age hill forts were for keeping democracy in, to protect the population from attack from outside. William the Conqueror built a series of castles expressly for the purpose of keeping democracy out. William claimed he owned the whole of England by right of conquest. Not, as Grey Owl said, man belonging to the land, but the land belonging to man, and in this case one in particular. This is perfectly democratic, so long as he holds it in trust for the public. But he saw it as in his personal gift. This is the epitome of capitalism. Something he hasn't created for himself, and there he is distributing shares in it. He then proceeded to pass it on to his descendants and others, called subinfeudation. Capitalism looks to the past and is a form of ancestor worship, where you are forced to worship the ancestors of others. Capitalism is not private enterprise. Capitalism is what destroys private enterprise, where you waste your life making money for somebody else. Oh, God Almighty. Socialism looks to the present. Nothing exists but the moment. The Euston Arch is pulled down and replaced by a brutalist, existentialist railway station. If you want to destroy a people, all you have to do is destroy their culture. And that is the the only thing that socialism is after. Like the ISIS state, everything that existed before the Great Prophet is laid waste. Mutatis mutandis for socialism. The attack on the Twin Towers was certainly not an attack on democracy. It wasn't so much an attack on the USA as an attack on capitalism. Like the rescue services, the 90% of the population of the planet who aren't either capitalists or socialists and simply want to be left alone to live their lives in peace and freedom, which is what and all that democracy means, are the ones who are caught in the crossfire. In socialism, people can't save for their own pensions because they are forced to pay for the pensions of the old. As in the Cultural Revolution in China and Pol Pot in Cambodia, the students teach their professors. Violence, even rape, is manifested in classrooms. Anyone wearing glasses is the enemy of socialism, whose true path lies in toiling in the fields, like with the peasants. Existentialism. Anyone raising his head above the mire in which they all exist is an elitist. You waste your life making money for everybody else. In the 1940s, the socialist Jean-Paul Sartre rightly said, "Hell is other people." In the 1980s, the capitalist Maggie Thatcher rightly said, "There's no such thing as society," and as she should have added for clarity, "only other people." 40 years later again, democracy says democracy is other people, but as they say in Yorkshire, there's note so queer as folk. Democracy looks to the future, to generations yet unborn, those who don't even have a vote. When you buy a house, or for that matter a car, you're not buying it for yourself, you're buying it for your descendants, whether currently in existence or not. Democracy requires that people hold their houses in trust for their children, indeed all future generations. When they grow up, it should not be the children moving out, but if anyone, the parents, to granny flats, retirement homes and the like. This passes wealth from one generation to the next, and thus conserves it for the benefit of all. This puts an end to parents releasing equity and squandering the proceeds on cruises and long-haul flights to obscure parts of the world just so the annuity is all used up, and thus also protects the environment. This money would be far better spent in founding some educational charity or other. It is to be noted that in the name of socialism, the Labour government has abolished tax relief for educational charities for one's own children, and which is thus another attack on democracy. In the name of social engineering, it wants to see all people forced not only to live next to those they may not want to live next to in social housing, and forced to educate their children next to others they may not want to in state schools. Objecting to this they call snobbery. There is no longer the need for an expanding population to man the armed forces to conquer and rule an empire. Democracy requires that parents educate their children, whether by insurance or otherwise. Democracy is not 5 years of capitalism to create the wealth followed by 5 years of socialism to grab it, swapping majorities with each other in the process. In majority rule, it is the 10% in the middle who get squeezed out of existence, the professional middle classes of engineers, scientists and teachers, who do all the creative work and have no political say whatever. If anyone doubts this, they need look no further than those wonderful cinema films, Mrs. Miniver, Brief Encounter and In Which We Serve. The first mention in particular was when shown to American audiences, was said by Churchill to be worth 2 battleships. When I was young, every town had its Lions tea room, where housewives could meet each other in the afternoons. Nor was this confined to the middle classes. The former England football manager Roy Hodgson was rightly proud to say that his father was a bus driver, and his mother was perfectly happy to describe herself as a housewife. One of my great uncles drove steam trains on the West Coast Main Line. The baker and the milkman would never dream of coming to the front door of even the simplest house, but would go round to the side. Nowadays, bakers and milkmen have been replaced by supermarkets. I recently tried to buy a sign saying tradesman's entrance from an ironmonger, but this was impossible. It was regarded as a matter of shame for a man to have to send his wife or daughter out to work. Wives now have to go out to work to provide enough money for mortgages, and this is a sign of progress. It's not a sign of progress, but a 50% reduction in the standard of living of the population as a whole. In that equally wonderful television comedy, The Good Life, the neighbours had to have a woman coming in to help the wife about the house, and the man had to have a gardener just to show they were a step above the working class. No middle-class family would dream of sending their children to state schools, especially the teachers in those schools and Labour Party prime ministers. Nowadays they are forced to look up the league tables with the best of them. When I was a child, railway carriages were either first class or third class, second class having long since ceased to exist, except in places such as India, where it is for such as the civil service. In this country, military officers travel first class at great public expense to keep them above their men when they should be mixing with them. On retiring from the armed forces and seeking employment, they are told to describe themselves as leaders of men. In the days of amateur cricketers, the gentlemen travelled first class, the players third. Nowadays they all travel first class, so much for democracy. The Titanic disaster is always portrayed as a conflict between the upper class and the lower class, with no reference to anybody in between. The former had the crew to look after them, and the latter were well accustomed to looking after themselves. No mention is ever made of the second class, who, with their after you to the lifeboats attitude, suffered by far the worst, with only 1 in 8 of the men surviving. Has anybody ever seen a remake of a film that was anywhere near as good as the original? Even Boris Karloff and Frankenstein. A Night to Remember dealt with the sinking of the Titanic, with the often heroic self-sacrifice of the passengers and crew. The eponymous remake, directed by that admitted socialist James Cameron, depicts it as part of a class war between the upper and lower classes, with no room for anything in between. It is the middle classes who, as the Stanley Baker character says in the best film ever made, The Cruel Sea, "Do all the work around here." This is a film ostensibly about an escort vessel on the Atlantic convoys, but in reality it is about the British, or in particular the English class system. The upper class have always had respect for skilled artisans like Capability Brown, and here represented by the captain of the vessel, who was the only professional seaman on board. They can't stand lower class upstarts who don't know their place. The first lieutenant, executive officer, had been a used car salesman, had spent the interwar years learning seamanship as a volunteer in the Naval Reserve. To cap it all, he liked sausages, which immediately marked him down as not PLU. The sub-lieutenants were a barrister, a journalist and a bank clerk. In those days at least, all upper-class activities, and had spent their time swanning about in 5-ton yawls in the Solent. They conspired together, as one of them puts it, "How can we get rid of him?" to make life intolerable for the first lieutenant, and he is forced out, one of them taking over in his place. The story is told from the point of view of the sub-lieutenant, so the victim is portrayed as a lazy incompetent, which I can say from experience is the usual way of getting rid of them. In swapping majorities with each other, majority rule has destroyed the middle class, the goose that lays the golden egg, leaving a two-party state which is nowhere nearer to democracy than is a one-party state. I am not here advocating proportional representation. At least with the first past the post system, you get the chance to vote for the government of the territory. Under proportional representation, you can only vote for an electoral college, giving power to careerist politicians like the Senate of ancient Rome. Like the barons at Runnymede, they were not after power for the people. The king having conquered the country, they wanted to divvy up the power among themselves. To protect the public, the tribune of the people, Tiberius Gracchus, was persuaded to declare himself king of Rome, but ended up face down in the Tiber for his trouble. It was not until Julius Caesar, a generation later, in declaring himself dictator for life, in effect the first emperor, that was achieved, if that is the right word. What better definition is there of a police state than one where, as in the UK for example, the police are paid more than the teachers? As Tony Blair rightly said, the only three things that matter are education, education and education. Whether in capitalism, whether private or state or capital or socialism, if that is a distinction with a difference, education is the only creator of wealth and investment for the future. The people making it are the teachers. How are they to receive the dividend on their investment? Should you pay 10, 15 or 20% of your subsequent income to your teachers? And how should it be divided up between primary, secondary and tertiary teachers? Deciding this at any one time is what politicians are for. It has been said by bankers that the ablest people should be bankers. Banking is the lowest form of trade apart from the trade in people. School staff car parks are the ones that should be full of Rolls Royces and Porsches, not bank staff car parks. It is bankers that have caused the present never-ending economic crisis, and only teachers that can get them out of it. In London there is a school for butlers, After qualifying, the graduates pay 10% of their salaries to their teachers. Why should it be different for others? As I prove in my stated book, economics is an illusion created by people calling themselves economists. Hans Christian Andersen wrote his wonderful story, The Emperor's New Suit of Clothes. I am in the position of the little boy who has never been told that he is supposed to believe that economics is the solution to life, the universe and everything. That all you've got to do to solve any problem, like COVID, is to throw money at it by borrowing it or simply forging it. In the 1980s there was a brief encounter with what was called monetarism, which in fact just meant non-Keynesian economics. This resulted, just like Churchill's brief return to the gold standard in the 1920s, with high unemployment, with which I deal later. I am not here suggesting that the Thatcher governments were anything like democratic. Their only aim was the abolition of exchange controls and a higher value of sterling by artificially raised interest rates so that the wealthy could ship their money abroad to protect it from any future Labour governments, like the disastrous ones of the preceding decade. This bled the country white. Except between other democratic countries, as they hopefully arise, will have to impose exchange controls to prevent their residents, including those known as non-domiciles, from doing likewise. The result is rather like safe corridors between low-COVID countries. Apart from this, economics means Keynesian economics. Under the feudal system, the king was subject only to the Lord Chancellor and his Court of Chancery as his confessor and keeper of his conscience, and thus the Pope of Rome. The primary function of the king is to lead the army into battle, to defend democracy against invasion, and like King Harold, to be the first to die in doing so. The second is to defend the currency. Money is the great defender of freedom and thus democracy. Money is not wealth, but wealth in action, and thus it distributes wealth. Instead we have Edward III snipping bits off the coins and quantitative easing, which is the exact modern equivalent. Both are acts of theft against the public and thus crimes against democracy. Government borrowing is an act of theft against future generations. Politics is the substitute for civil war, and election victory should extinguish all government debts except those obtained in democracy and defending democracy itself. Post-war credits are a prime example. Debts entered into in defending the population against COVID are also defending democracy. It is said that we will be paying off the borrowing caused by COVID for decades to come. We refers to future generations who are presumably supposed to be obliged to us for producing them. It was said in the 1960s that the government then in power would remain in power for half a century because it could borrow against the North Sea oil and gas that had recently been discovered to provide an ever-increasing standard of living. Natural resources are capital assets which are not to be squandered by the government of the day, but stored in some other capital form, such as Bitcoin. Thus, the war between the older generation, or at least certain parts of it, determined to hang on to their power by any means, even if it means the destruction of the planet by one-sided mutually assured destruction or climate change, and the younger generation determined to save their birthright As Professor Paul Ehrlich said, always beware old men who don't care. Capitalism and socialism are not opposites but two sides of the same coin. If capitalism were the private or state is the enemy, then socialism is the false friend. Both are crimes against democracy. There is a concerted advertising campaign by HM government to try to con the next generation into taking up careers not as merchant bankers or financiers, but as engineers and technologists, and most particularly as teachers. Thus they end up in dead-end jobs in factories and on building sites, or worst of all in schools, where daily they have to face those who are taught by their parents that teachers represent authority and are thus the enemy. They would be much better off, even financially, forgetting about being intelligent and becoming family doctors or even hairdressers, where they would at least have a profession they could take around the world. Her Majesty's loyal opposition does nothing whatever to oppose this, preferring simply to grab as much as they can of the proceeds by socialism. The fallacy of Keynesian economics is the St. Petersburg paradox. You can't go on stealing from both the older generation by devaluation of their savings, which is their only means of support, apart from having penny to children, which just encourages them to have more, and from future generations by pledging their credit forever. Genesis 41 tells of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Keynes says you can have 7 years of famine followed by 7 years of abundance. If you can't eat books of economics, what possible use are they? Quantitative easing is theft, and the victims are those people who are forced to hold their assets in that currency. Unlike Bitcoin and to a lesser extent gold and other tangibles, fiat currencies are redeemable only to the extent that future generations are able and willing to redeem them. On losing an election, those politicians who entered into the debts should be held personally liable for them. Democratic political parties should state that they will not be liable for the debts entered into by previous governments, except in time of war and other attacks on democracy. Churchill said that democracy, by which he meant majority rule, is the worst form of government apart from any other. I have shown that there is a better form of government, and that is indeed democracy.